and our guest today, Guy Edwards, who's a research fellow and co-director and co-founder of the Climate and Development Lab at Brown University, and somebody who's widely published and well known in the climate and energy circles of Latin America. As I said, we're going to run this a little bit differently. We will still include questions from participants, and so as we've done before, and just in case you haven't joined us before, we use the chat function, and you can pose these questions throughout the course of the conversation, throughout the course of the webinar. You can feel free also if you just want to make some comments, but the chat function is right here at the bottom of the screen. It's there's a toolbar there, and then when you pose your comment or question and hit return, it'll show up on that that screen there. And after Guy and I are done with our conversation, we've got about 6 specific questions we're going to run through. Take about 30 minutes. Once we've done with that, we'll try and weave in some time. You know, we're hoping about 10 or 15 minutes for questions from the participants and audience. So again, this topic of climate change, and one that Guy has studied intensely for several years in a variety of capacities. As a matter of fact, and he'll talk about this in a minute, but he and another gentleman named Professor Timmons Roberts have literally written a book on the role of Latin America when it comes to climate change, and that's a book they published for the MIT Press. At the Institute, the topic of the Paris Agreement is one that, as we prepared for our annual conference in May, so the annual La Jolla conference, since last December, it became a topic of utmost interest and ended up being the sort of #1 topic and issue that cut through all the panels. And in fact, it was the opening discussion and opening panel of the conference. And there was a lot of different takeaways, and I don't want to get into too many of them, other than to say one of the major takeaways was how much political will was being generated in December last year in Paris, but then later in April in the UN in New York. The levels of transparency, the boosting of dialogue between nations, the bottom-up approach. But there was also some concerns over the targets and goals and commitments and how countries will reach those and whether they will reach those. So sort of the managing expectations element. But I'll end here and then turn it over to Guy by saying there was a metaphor one of the panelists used at the end of the discussion in La Jolla this May that I thought really summarized this well, and I think gets to the core of what we're going to talk about today. And this panelist said that the Paris Agreement is like a plane, where all the passengers have agreed it's time to land, but at speed and where to land are the key questions that now need to be agreed upon and determined. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Guy Edwards, who, as I said, is a widely published author on the issue of climate change and global politics, and especially in Latin America. He lived for a while. In fact, when I first got to know him, he was in Ecuador, working in the Amazon. As I mentioned, he is a co-director and co-founder of the Climate and Development Lab at Brown University in Rhode Island, where he's joining us from today. And so, Guy, I'm going to turn it over to you. Let's start our conversation. As I say, you literally wrote the book. What does your book, you know, in a minute, summarize your book for us to begin our conversation today?
Great. Thanks very much, Jeremy, and to Jacqueline as well for the invitation to join you all today. Thanks to all those joining us. It's great to finally have a conversation with the energy program at the Institute of Americas. So I really appreciate sharing this space with you. And I think what we really aimed to do with the book was to try and take Latin American climate policy out of the UN climate change negotiation space and do a better job of trying to talk about other issues related to climate policy in the region, such as economic development, trade, the role of civil society, and natural resource management. Because we felt that climate policy was too often seen only through the lens of the UN negotiations, which only told part of the story. So we decided to look at a number of case studies from the region, ranging to Mexico, Costa Rica, and Ecuador, to kind of tell the story of where Latin American leadership on climate change was, where it was coming from, but also what was undermining that leadership. And during the course of the research, we had over about 60 interviews, more or less, with a number of Latin Americans from civil society. It was an enriching experience. I think the key takeaways was the idea that Latin American countries, for the most part, are incredibly engaged on this issue, and we can really see that with the Paris Agreement as well, which I think we're going to talk about. But yeah, that was the main idea of the book.
Perfect. No, I think that's perfect in terms of, because this issue of the engagement of Latin America is exactly where we want to start getting into our conversation today. I mean, we put the question together: what are the prospects for implementing the Paris Agreement in Latin America? And I guess the secondary part is what could slow down progress or inhibit progress. And so let's take that piece of this conversation and help us understand prospects and potential hurdles and shortfalls.
Yeah, so starting with the prospects, I think it's very encouraging that the ratification of the Paris Agreement is progressing quite well, and there's definitely some very encouraging signs that the agreement could actually come into effect potentially this year or next. And just to give you an idea, since the start of the month, 22 states have ratified the agreement, and from Latin America that includes Peru, Guyana, Belize, and Barbados. And this, in terms of the region's kind of commitment, this is a promising step, and other countries such as Costa Rica, Brazil, and Mexico are seeking to join the agreement this year also. So it seems as though there's not necessarily many barriers to ratifying the agreement in the region, but more just the legislative processes can be quite cumbersome in some cases, but for the most part there don't seem to be too many kind of political barriers per se, more bureaucratic ones. So this is a great step, or a great sign, that Latin American countries are very supportive of the agreement coming into force as soon as possible. And looking a bit more broadly, the US and China are hoping to join the agreement this year, and this will be fundamental to getting beyond the required threshold for the agreement to actually come into effect, which is representing at least 55% of the global emissions have to ratify it. So the US and China together represent about 30 or so percent, and then with other countries who are looking to join this year as well, that should get us over the threshold, so the agreement could come into effect by this November's next conference of the parties, which is being held in Marrakesh. So that would be a really fantastic signal of how seriously countries are taking it. So I think that's a good initial sign. And then just to complement that, I think one of the reasons why countries in the region are very keen to ratify it is because there's growing awareness of the benefits of implementing the goals of the Paris Agreement, and thinking about the ratification process as a way to think in a slightly new way in terms of promoting cleaner engines of growth, namely renewable energy, and also trying to build cleaner and more resilient cities. And I think a lot of lawmakers are starting to kind of join the dots between the goals of this agreement and building a more prosperous and low emission kind of development pathway, which is very encouraging.
Quick, we have this image on the screen here, in Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Venezuela, and Colombia, in that order, are the largest emitters in Latin America.
Yeah.
In that order, when do these countries ratify, if you could, their participation in the Paris Accord?
So Brazil is hoping to ratify this year, and last month their Chamber of Deputies approved the agreement, so it's now going up to the Senate, and there doesn't really appear to be any barriers to Brazil joining this year. The case of Mexico, Mexico will introduce the Paris Agreement into their Congress in their next ordinary session next month now. And similarly, there doesn't seem to, well, it's unlikely that there will be any real barriers to Mexico joining the agreement this year. And then Argentina and Venezuela, the next largest emitters. Venezuela, we don't really know at the moment, given the political economic crisis there. Clearly, there's other priorities to tend to. Argentina, Mauricio Macri has made some quite encouraging noises about kind of rebooting Argentina's climate policy. But I'm not quite sure at the moment what their timetable is.
In Colombia, any sense? I mean, obviously Colombia, there's a similar dominant issue of the peace process that seems to suck all the oxygen out of the public policy discourse there. But what about the Paris Agreement?
Yeah, I think in Colombia's case, my understanding was from talking to a couple of negotiators at the last UN session in Bonn, was this year is probably unlikely given the peace process, but next year is much more certain, and there's no question they're very committed to ratifying as soon as possible. But as you say, the political space is very limited at present.
Yeah, super. Do you want anything else you want to say, or you want to move on to our next question?
Yeah, I'll just up on the screen at the moment the slide, the Latin America's INDCs, just to kind of complement what's kind of going on there. So as part of the Paris round of negotiations, all countries were invited to submit these national climate pledges or intended nationally determined contributions. And this was the first time countries were actually asked to do it. And just to give a flavor, Colombia reduced its emissions by 20% compared to business as usual levels by 2030, or 30% with international support. And for the most part, the INDCs from the region are not overly ambitious. Only really Brazil's and Costa Rica's INDCs stand out as being slightly more on the kind of ambitious side. And that's not to say that these contributions are very valuable, but just to kind of to put it in its correct context, the current batch of INDCs from Latin America, except that of Costa Rica, are not currently in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement, and specifically the temperature goals to maintain global temperatures well below 2 degrees and aspire to 1.5. So there's still quite a lot of work to kind of ratchet up the level of ambition in these INDCs, but not to take away from the fact that this was a very new process. And what's very encouraging is that in the role of the INDCs, or the process to create these INDCs, has been very helpful in trying to kind of increase the salience of climate policy at the national level more generally. And there's been a lot more buy-in from stakeholders such as the private sector and civil society actors as well in the INDC process, which has been until now really unheard of. So I think the INDCs are seen as quite a revolutionary tool, and a strategic tool at that, for kind of catalyzing kind of climate action in these countries. And just to give you a sense of what's next, countries will hold a facilitative dialogue in 2018 to review the level of ambition in these current batch of INDCs. So that will be another kind of political moment, as it were, to try and kind of ratchet up the ambition. But for the most part, the INDC process has been very encouraging in the region.
And that's when people talk about the bottom-up approach that was so different in Paris, right? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, totally. And there's still a lot of tension about whether the Paris Agreement is just a little too flaky in that
Mhm.
respect, in terms
Yeah.
of letting countries kind of decide for themselves. But I think where it's arguably much more kind of revolutionary than the Kyoto Protocol is that countries have to keep on coming back every 5 years through this ambition mechanism, and each national pledge they submit every 5 years, they have to increase the level of ambition. And when you match that up with the temperature goals and the goal to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions in the second half of this century, there's it's a very ambitious agreement when you look at all the pieces together, which are kind of meant to be complementary.
No, I mean, not to beat the drum of the panel here, but I think that was exactly it. I think folks were very laudatory, but also there's a bit of reservation as to, let's see how these first few years, and then when they hit that 5-year mark, um, how this mechanism writ large is going to work.
Yeah,
Let's move on. Let's move on to some, like, dial down a little bit to the region specifically in terms of
yeah,
connections and. Um, the infrastructure, climate change, and resilience agendas in the region are not currently very well connected. Why is it so important to connect them? But let's actually step before you answer that. Let's better understand. If you could help us better understand what is meant by the resilience agenda. Is that the adaptation? Is that what help us understand what resilience agenda means, and then let's get to this connection question.
yeah. So thinking about the resilience agenda, there's a particular definition that I've been using, and that's I quote, the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and reorganize while undergoing change, so as to still
Mm,
retain essentially the same function, structure, identity, and feedbacks. And I think what is so important about kind of making the connection between infrastructure and the climate and resilience agendas in the region is how, firstly, how vulnerable Latin American countries are. And in terms of the region's vulnerability, the list is troublingly very long, but just one example I think is particularly poignant is the fact that glaciers are all already melting and disappearing in the Andes, and these glaciers are relied upon by millions of people for both electricity from hydropower, for human consumption, and for agriculture. And if we're looking at temperature rise of over, well, this century, potentially anywhere between 2 and 5 degrees, nearly all these glaciers will disappear. So when we're talking about kind of large infrastructure projects in the region, and just to give an idea, the kind of infrastructure gap in the region at present is vast, and some estimates suggest that up to 5% of Latin America's GDP, or roughly 250 billion US dollars, will be required to meet future demands to build infrastructure, transport, energy, water, sanitation, and communication services. So I think the point that I'm trying to make here is the idea that a kind of business as usual kind of infrastructure kind of program it just won't do. It's that kind of modus operandi is now defunct given the vulnerability of the region. So we need to ensure these large-scale infrastructure development projects are climate smart and resilient, but also sustainable, to ensure that as both the impacts of climate change become more present, these projects can actually kind of take it, as it were, but also that Latin America's energy infrastructure isn't compromised rather by these increasingly ambitious climate goals and the sustainable development agenda more broadly. So I think that's what I was kind of getting at.
Let me ask you something here, because there's something I've heard amongst some folks that I think is a very interesting question for certain countries in Latin America, and that is getting to your point about resilience, which I sort of think of in terms of adaptation. We've talked for years about mitigation, but also adaptation. And there's the
Yeah,
criticism out there that the most vulnerable are also the least financially able, or in the position they're not able to make those infrastructure investments to deal with a rising temperature. So how do you address that social equity question of the most vulnerable at the same time not being in a position to pay for change in sea level? I mean, sitting here in San Diego, if we start to understand the sea level rise in the port of San Diego and all the places down the harbor and bay, we'll figure out a way to financially cover that and make sure we're adapted here. How does that happen? Let's take some of the Caribbean nations, for example.
sure. Well, I suppose what's most troubling about the impacts of climate change is that the least well off and the most kind of vulnerable members of society are being hit first and worst by these climate impacts. And of course, the actual physical integrity of Caribbean nations are under threat from sea level rise. And I think a big part of this inevitably is the finance side.
Yeah.
And rich developed countries have a number of obligations to contribute increasing amounts of climate finance, but also capacity building and technology transfer to support these nations make the transition to more low emission and resilient economies. And that support thus far hasn't necessarily really been coming in the quantity that it should be. And developed countries are definitely on the ropes in terms of not meeting those. And
Yeah, somebody's sorry to jump in, but I think it'd be perfect. We said we're going to get to some Q&A, but let's. There's a question here that gets right to something you just mentioned. So if you don't mind, this question that Jorge's posed about the Green Climate Fund and how will that be used in Latin America? Which countries are most likely to benefit from it? So any insights you can offer on that?
Thanks for the question. So climate finance, kind of generally in Latin America, is it's rather tricky for the region, in as far as that Latin America is not it's regarded as a middle income region, and it's not considered either like alongside the least or the island states, so it doesn't tend to get as much attention in terms of climate finance. And the climate finance that it does get mostly goes to Brazil and Mexico, and most of the existing finance is still concentrated in mitigation rather than adaptation. And that is rather problematic because the bill for investing in kind of serious adaptation projects is massive, and quite frankly, Latin American countries don't currently have the resources to do that. But there is increasing attention to the adaptation agenda in the region, and we saw this with the INDCs, that for the most part Latin American countries had quite well developed sections on adaptation in addition to mitigation sections. But at the moment, the Green Climate Fund, there are, I think, 2 projects which are being financed by the Green Climate Fund in the region. I think there's one in Peru, and then there's a regional wide project on green energy bonds. And I believe El Salvador might be in line for the next tranche of projects as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks for letting us jump there. And Jorge, thanks for the question. We'll go ahead. We've got now our getting into the emissions profile. We talked a little bit about this before, in terms of the largest emitters. But let's take
Yeah.
this again and talk about the transition toward low emission, and again the idea of resilient energy systems. So, well, there's the question. What's the answer?
Right. Yeah, that's quite a big question. Yeah. So I'd just probably say that Latin America has, as you all know very well, I mean, given the dominance of hydropower, Latin America's energy matrix is already relatively low carbon anyway. But due to economic growth and increasing demand, strain capacity, the region is including a greater share of fossil fuels. And what has become apparent in the last couple of years or so is that the energy sector now represents the region's largest source of emissions.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons for that is because countries like Brazil have been so successful in reducing their levels of deforestation. But nonetheless, emissions from the energy sector, especially transport, are one of the fastest growing sectors. And I think what's potentially troubling about this is that the Paris Agreement is explicit in that it sends a very clear message to policymakers and investors that the phasing out of fossil fuels by 2050 is required, and that all investments must be consistent with reaching net zero emissions this century. So I think it's worth pointing out that a kind of business as usual kind of energy policy in the region just is perhaps rather kind of out of sync with what not only the Paris Agreement is calling for, but also the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think if I could just add something quickly about the role of development banks, some research produced by Boston University said that only 33% of all development finance, bank finance in Latin America, it's not actually green, and most of this finance is going to extractive industries and infrastructure projects that exacerbate global warming. And this report said that green finance only makes up 20% of total development bank financing. So we can kind of see the key role required by the multilateral development banks, right, but also just which way the wind is currently blowing at the moment. And it's still blowing in a direction of focusing on fossil fuels. And, well, as I just said, I mean, this is largely out of sync with the Paris Agreement. But I think there is definitely some encouraging evidence emerging, especially given the rapid growth of renewable energy in the region. And as we saw last year, records were being broken left, right, and centre with levels of clean energy investment globally, but also in Latin America, and new renewable energy capacity being brought online. So there does seem to be some quite encouraging signs, but it's how fast renewables are going to be able to kind of grow in the region, especially in the transport sector, because I think electricity-wise, a lot of progress is being made, but just given how dirty kind of the transport sector remains in Latin America, I think that's going to need to be a key focus.
Absolutely, and I think you've seen the auctions in Mexico, and you mentioned the Macri government earlier, and their goal of basically taking Argentina from next to no renewables to a larger percentage by the end of their term, and auctions at the end of this month for renewables there. There's a question, and again, I think this I'll insert it here because it's part of our conversation on this slide. The question of methane emissions reductions, because I think it's an important one, perhaps more globally, but it's definitely one you hear about, and especially there's this comment here from Amy mentions in the context of recent commitments by the North American countries. Mexico signed on to the 40 to 45% reductions by 2025. talk a little bit about methane emissions and help us understand a little bit more, because we're talking about a couple different kinds of emissions, right?
Yeah. So normally people talk about the kind of low carbon transformation that's required, but I mean, as evidence has recently emerged, methane not only being considerably more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, but also how much methane is released, especially from shale gas, that people weren't necessarily aware of. And I think the Obama administration has reacted pretty fast to this, and I think this step by the NAFTA countries as well to kind of to look at this issue more seriously is encouraging as well. But I think what's fascinating is that the US's kind of shale gas kind of revolution is being, well, it appears to be looking like quite an attractive option for a number of Latin American countries, and this is, I think, problematic in as far as that it's not only about the potential increase in emissions, and I think it's very risky to suggest that natural gas or shale gas can be considered this kind of bridging fuel towards kind of cleaner forms of energy, because, well, it's, some research suggests that it releases more emissions than coal and oil. But I think the key point I'd make here about the shale gas is the idea that the energy transformation required to keep global temperature rise within a safe kind of space requires a rapid shift to low emission energy. And I think thinking about gas as a bridging fuel is potentially a distraction, and we should really be going directly to renewable energy. And I think that should really be the priority.
That's no understatement. That's a pretty bold statement.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Well, let's use that, and then we'll pivot to a different question. Again, a pretty broad question. Maybe we can come back to that comment about natural gas, the role of natural gas, because there obviously is a lot of focus on not just bridge as a bridge fuel, but sort of complementarity, especially in terms of firming power, and as you mentioned, in a largely hydro-dependent region. So, but let's talk about cooperation. I mean, this is something at the Institute we always focus on: regional integration, regional cooperation. How can countries of the region enhance their cooperation on climate change?
Yeah. Well, I think encouragingly on the energy point again, there seems to have been some quite positive steps in terms of the increasing into integrating Latin America's currently isolated national transmission systems, and how this could provide a significant boost for renewables. And I think although this kind of integration of grids is still rather incipient, progress is being made. And I understood there's a project currently under discussion between Colombia and Chile to modernize and set up an interconnected grid, and also with improvements to existing links between Ecuador and Peru. And well, I think as we've seen with the proposed energy union in between EU countries, this is seen as a great way to create a more reliable source of energy, and also a cleaner and cheaper one as well. So I think if Latin American countries could kind of increase their cooperation on integrating these energy systems, that would be a great step. But as our book, as the title suggests, The Fragmented Continent, Latin American countries don't speak with one voice at the UN climate change talks. And although countries in the region do agree that it's a priority and that adaptation especially is essential, in terms of like the specific policy discussions, there is some quite a lot of divergence between countries in how to actually advance this agenda, and there is some progress being made between some of the subgroups. And just to give one example, the Pacific Alliance, which their negotiating group at the UN climate change talks is called the ILAC group, the Independent Association of Latin America and the Caribbean. And these countries seem to be definitely on the same page. And just one example, the meeting of the Pacific Alliance in Chile, there was some encouraging comments made about integrating the country's financial systems, which could help spur investment in areas such as infrastructure. And given the kind of encouraging discourse about the need for climate action, I think this is potentially quite an encouraging step.
Just to clarify, so the Pacific Alliance countries, correct me if I'm wrong, Mexico, Chile, Colombia, Peru, at this stage are the formal member, right?
Yeah.
And then I think Costa Rica is an observer, and Argentina was playing an observer role as well.
Exactly, yeah.
Excellent. There is let's go to this question here from Arno, which is a question on carbon pricing, and I think this is very important for folks in industry, and this carbon tax question. Do you see that as a likely solution to be implemented by governments? Is there a regional linkage, for instance, in North America, for instance, based on the market created in California and Quebec? Talk a little bit about carbon pricing.
Yeah. So, thanks. It's a great question, and I have to admit some of the evidence about the use of carbon pricing and indeed carbon trading, it is regarded as some by not only a distraction but potentially relatively the gains in terms of reducing emissions could be rather superficial, because the price of carbon wouldn't be set that high, so businesses, industry wouldn't have that greater incentives to actually reduce their emissions. And in terms of the carbon taxes as well, they wouldn't be that high either. So I think some folks are rather skeptical about the ability of these tools to actually help reduce emissions. But at the same time, I think some other folks are a little skeptical about the difficulties in not only integrating carbon markets between different countries, but thinking about a global carbon price. I think we're some way off from that. And I have to admit, I am a little skeptical. But I think for a problem as great as climate change, all kind of potential solutions need to be on the table, and clearly we need tools at our disposal. So I definitely wouldn't rule it out, but there does need to be a certain level of divergence on how effective these tools could be.
Okay, I think. Well, okay, let's come back to that, because I think there might be some relevance to that in this final question that we want to put forth before we wrap up. We're talking about cooperation just now in Latin America and some linkages, but let's now link Latin America with, as the question says, its largest partners, the United States, EU, and China, and how do these blocks of nations work together to improve cooperation on climate change and low emission development? And maybe you can add, maybe the carbon price fits into this conversation as well. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so I think Latin American countries, for the most part, have really been punching above their weight on climate policy, and I think in the last few years, the US and the EU, as developed countries and who have been more responsible due to their emissions, but especially in the case of the EU, much more engaged in global climate governance, have been increasingly looking at Latin America as a key partner, both at the UN and bi-regionally. And I think in the case of the EU, Latin American and Caribbean cooperation, there has been some very positive attempts in terms of trying to mainstream climate change into their strategic partnership. And looking really across the board in terms of the climate diplomacy at the UN negotiations, but also increasing levels of investment in clean energy projects from, for instance, the European Investment Bank in Latin America, but also more traditional types of development cooperation. So the EU and Latin America and the Caribbean seems to be a pretty robust partnership in terms of their activities on climate. China and Latin America haven't really been doing much at all yet. That seems to be at a much earlier stage, and I suppose it's perhaps helpful to frame China's relationship with Latin America as we all know has tended to be focused more on access to natural resources, including fossil fuels. And although there has been some discussions about the importance of environmental protection and climate change and renewable energy, the progress there is rather limited. But China is at least investing increasing sums in hydroelectric projects in the region and also renewable energy. So there does seem to be a lot of potential there. And lastly, the US, one of Obama's flagship policies in the region was the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas. And I think this has proved to be a very useful partnership, especially at the technical level between experts and energy specialists. But it did seem to fall by the wayside somewhat. But I think looking at Hillary Clinton's platform, she has said that she wants to put climate change as one of her key foreign policy components, and similarly promoting this idea of a kind of clean energy revolution in the US. So I think Latin America could really benefit from what we would hope to be a Clinton administration focusing on those two elements. I think that could be a very positive step for the region, and one which, given incredible potential for renewables in Latin America, could be a real kind of marriage of convenience or very mutually beneficial.
I think it's interesting to point about China. I mean, that seems to be, and I hadn't thought about it, a pretty massive question mark when we talk about this broader cooperation question.
Yeah.
We're running out of time here. We did say we're going to end at quarter till, but if anyone else, I mean, we've woven in some of the questions so far. Don't forget, and anyone who missed the introduction, there is a toolbar here and a chat function. You can type the questions there if you have any last second burning questions for Guy. I think we've covered a lot of material here, and I appreciate your earnestness in answering and these questions, especially some of the interesting pieces you mentioned on carbon pricing and these other elements. So there's always more to talk about, but we'll probably leave it there unless anyone has a last second question. I will quickly promote our next webinar, and we're going to look more in depth at the role and independence of energy regulators in Chile, Peru, and Mexico. And hopefully everyone has received now the report that our non-resident fellow Francisco Javier Salazar produced just about a week or so ago. And he's going to actually present that study and the results of that study online in a webinar. And then our in-person events, picking up some of these issues we've been talking a lot about today, the energy transition and how countries, it wasn't that long ago that Peru hosted a conference of the parties the year before Paris, if I'm not mistaken. So we'll be in Peru September 14th and 15th for an energy and sustainability roundtable. And to your point, Guy, earlier, you talked about what's called the CNEA, the the Sistema de Interconexión Eléctrica Andina, so the effort to interconnect the Andean countries from Colombia to Chile. That'll be a major piece of conversation, as well as the bilateral integration, electric interconnection of Chile and Peru at that roundtable in Lima. And then, again, these themes are always on the tips of our tongue here, and we're going to look in Mexico and hopefully get some updates. You mentioned their commitments in the coming legislative session to put forth ratification of the Paris Agreement, and so hopefully we'll get some folks from the government to come to our event on October 13th and share the latest on that. So that's it from here in La Jolla. Thanks again, Guy Edwards. A virtual round of applause is merited. I really appreciate you taking the time today to share your expertise and insights. And after many years of conversing and exchanging details on social media, it's a pleasure to formally host you today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. We look forward to seeing you in person or here online on August 25th. Thank you.
Thank you.